to be with you. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for turning up. I know that many of you have been told this is a compulsory class. For those who are here under compulsion, put up your hands. I want to know who you are. I saw you there, man. Let's make it interactive. I want to speak for, I don't know, maybe 25 or 30 minutes, but I really want your views and your questions as well about the politics of South Africa. But most of all, what I want to speak about is the politics of this disease. And I want to start where I think we must also end. And it's 30 years since the first diagnosis of HIV was made. Medical morbidity and lethality reports in your country in May 1981 for the first time made a diagnosis of HIV. And it was in the Reagan era, just a few months before a very conservative, popular president had taken office. And we didn't know what it hit us at that time. It was an epidemic that focused mainly on people like myself, people who were gay men, white gay men in their midlives. And eventually the toll amongst people like that, again, people very like myself in your country, to be nearly 750,000 total AIDS deaths. We didn't know that when it first happened. But the defining feature of the epidemic from the very beginning was stigma. President Reagan, as the toll mounted through the tens of thousands, through the hundreds of thousands, past the 500,000 mark, didn't mention AIDS. The first time he mentioned AIDS was in 1987. Randy Schultz, in his very lopsided account of those years, calls it unwavering silence on the part of President Reagan. And the reason President Reagan refused to speak about AIDS was that he considered it, and his silence endorsed that view, that this was a judgment. That AIDS was a judgment on the practitioners of same-sex sexual conduct. And that judgment has remained. It's a stigma that attaches to the disease 30 years later. I was talking to some of your colleagues here in public health. We speak about the stigma in the African American community in North Carolina, in the newly arrived African community in Durham, in rural North Carolina. The defining feature of this epidemic remains stigma. It's a powerful stigma. I want to come to a moment about why the disease is so stigmatized. But first I want to tell you about my own experience of stigma. I was diagnosed with HIV nearly 25 years ago, at the end of 1986. That in itself is a very hopeful thing to say, because here I am, in Durham, with you, enjoying this afternoon, and grateful to you for turning out for our discussion this afternoon. I was diagnosed, I was a young man, as Larry said. I'd started the human rights practice in Johannesburg. It was a difficult and exciting time to be a lawyer in South Africa, because the apartheid government was cracking down on its opponents. It was the last 5 or 10 years. At that stage we didn't know that we'd have a near miraculous transition a few years later, but the apartheid government was cracking down. And yet there was still room for legal opposition to it. So to be a human rights lawyer was exciting. And in the middle of this, I got a diagnosis of HIV. It was one of the most shattering experiences I've ever had, because at that point, I was not yet 33 years old. It was incurable. And I was certain that I would be dead within a very few years. So I faced this, and it was a profoundly shocking and depressing fact to have to deal with at that point in my life. But worse than the feeling that this was a death sentence, worse than the thought that I'd be dead before 40, it was something else. It was a feeling of intimidation. I can't express to you strongly enough how powerful that feeling was, the feeling that something unclean had taken control of my body. My blood was infested with something impure, something mutant, and something that was passing a judgment on me. I had come out as a gay man only a few years earlier after a failed marriage. And I was speaking last night at a seminar on diversity in the South African Constitution, diversity as a constitutional value. One of the best examples in my country of the valuing of diversity, because we came from this history of oppression, the rigidity and sameness of the apartheid ideology, is gay and lesbian equality in my country, where we've achieved legally, at least in constitution, full recognition of it. And I had come to that position in my life where I vowed I would never again apologize for my same-sex orientation. It's a natural variant, and I hope that it will be accepted as that natural variant of human sexuality, but not accepted as that 25 years ago. And having just come out, and having become infected within a year or two after my own coming out, I'm divorced from my female wife, I thought this is too terrible. I felt ashamed of having been infected with that child. I thought, here I am, a proponent of gay and lesbian equality, a fighter for a free South Africa, a non-racial, democratic South Africa, in which gay and lesbian people can take their rightful part. I become infected with this violence. I saw it as a condemnation of my own conduct. But I was wrong. I was wrong. The stigma in my own mind and elsewhere had nothing to do with the fact that I was gay. I dealt with my diagnosis by turning it into a great secret deep within myself, some frozen, deep place within myself. And I carried on with my work as best I could. And my work took me into work with the trade unions in South Africa, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, the National Union of Mine Workers. And through that work, I met people entirely different from myself in their social specificities. People who were black, people who were female, people who came from rural areas, people who said, the only sexual partner I've ever had is my husband, who's a mine worker, and he infected me. And those black women expressed exactly the same sense of contamination and shame as I felt. And it was an important revelation to me because I realized that that sense of stigma has not got to do with homosexuality at all. It's got to do with something different, something broader. I think, this is, we can come back to this, we'll talk about it later, I think it's to do with the sexual transmission of the disease. We're dealing in South Africa with a tremendous co-epidemic of tuberculosis. Most people with HIV in fact die of tuberculosis in South Africa. And we're finding ways, there are hopeful new initiatives to deal with the tuberculosis epidemic. There used to be a stigma about tuberculosis, or there used to be a stigma about many diseases, and rightfully, because stigma is a brand of shame, of condemnation, which relates to our fear for something. And sometimes it's understandable. When a disease is contagious, the disease can be passed on. The stigma is there in a way to try to protect one from contamination, from infection with it. But with HIV, the stigma has been enormous, despite the fact that it is very, very difficult to transmit. Why is it so stigmatized? I don't think that this has been adequately understood by social scientists or by psychologists. I think it's to do with the fact that the drive to sex, to human conjunction, the joining of two human bodies is such an important and profound part of our nature. We come into the world separate, and we want to join. Sex should be a joyful affirmation of that unity. And in that moment of copulation, instead of being joyful and life-affirming, and if it's different sex, instead of carrying within it the possibility of a further generativity, a further life, instead of that, the transmission of an infectious agent. And I think it's to do with that, with the nature of transmissive conduct. We have so many taboos about sex, and understandably, it's understandable because it is such a profound, intimate impulse in all our human lives. I think we don't quite understand why the stigma arises from the sex, and we need to understand it better. I was struck, as I said, coming here, by being told how strong stigma is in your community. And I think that we need to understand the sexual nature of it, it's linked to the sexual transmission. We associate sex with condemnation, envy, with prurience, very powerful emotions that we associate. When someone gets a disease through the sexual act, there's a particular sense of shame, embarrassment, and self-blame linked to it. I don't want to go into the whole issue of self-stigma. I want to mention here that the concept of external stigma is much better understood by medical scientists and social scientists and lawyers than internal stigma. In my book, the one that Mary mentioned, I speak about the internalized stigma. People know that they have no reason to fear their colleagues or to fear being barred access to healthcare or to housing or to other benefits. People who, from a sense of inner shame, are unable to go for a diagnosis or to accept a diagnosis or to talk about a diagnosis with themselves. So this was my experience. I took my fight with HIV from an inward place where I left it into my work as a lawyer. I became someone who acted vigorously for rationality in the treatment of HIV during our constitutional transition. In 1990 to 1994, we acted to draft a national AIDS plan, which in August 1994, shortly before President Mandela appointed me a judge at the end of that year, was adopted by the US. A very good plan. But President Mandela himself, this extraordinary man, had spent 27 years in jail. He knew about the epidemic. In 1990, fewer than 2% of South Africans had HIV. By the time the ANC took power after the democratic elections of April 1994, the national prevalence was almost 5%, 1 in 20 South Africans. And the national prevalence with a distinct racial demography. That's key important to understand. White South Africans outside the gay community like myself were barely affected. Indian South Africans of South Asian descent, or Indian South Africans, barely affected. Even South Africans of what we call mixed race descent or colours were much less affected. The prevalence of HIV was almost exclusively confined to the black African majority of South Africa. President Mandela knew all of this, because he too, like President Reagan, was unable to speak about it. The first time he spoke about HIV was in 1997 when he went to Davos in Switzerland to the World Economic Forum. He didn't even speak in South Africa, he spoke at Davos. The first time the word AIDS appeared in his speech was nearly 3 years after he became president of the democratic constitution of South Africa. In his case, unlike President Reagan, it wasn't the Randy Schultzian implied condemnation. God deserved to hate. He's not a man like that. He's a man of generous spirit. He was too embarrassed to mention. We'd asked him to, we begged him to, we got an admission to his office. He passed on to the deputy president. We'd asked him to call around this as a subject of national awareness because prevalence was sweeping like wildfire. Incidence was rising across South Africa in the very years after we became a democracy. We couldn't talk about it. One big thing that occurred in the middle of his presidency, that was the availability of treatment, which was the most extraordinary development in the history of AIDS. What had happened when I encountered the AIDS epidemic in a social group other than the one in which I found myself, white gay men in their midlives, reasonably affluent professional men, I encountered the first manifestation of what was to become a massive epidemic in our own country amongst black heterosexuals. It was an epidemic that had come down from Uganda, from the south of Sudan, through Kenya, Malawi, Burundi, Rwanda, through Zambia, Mozambique, through Zimbabwe and Botswana into South Africa. And of course, the opening of our borders with the coming of democracy, the vanquishment of apartheid between 1990 and 1994, led to the return of many South African soldiers fighting the liberation armies. They too came back with HIV, chased up the incidents, spread the prevalence of HIV around. And we had a very different epidemic. We had the epidemic which, unlike anywhere else in the world, was a mass heterosexual epidemic. It wasn't one that was confined principally to subgroups, risk groups, gay men, men having sex with men, intravenous drug users, commercial sex workers, people using their services. Very, very different epidemic. A national issue which challenged the Mandela government morally and strategically and in its management of the epidemic. The Mandela government did almost nothing. But something had happened. was about to mention that when I paused. That was the availability of treatment. All across Africa, the death toll had been absolutely enormous. But at the International AIDS Conference in Vancouver, July 1996, Dr. David Ho in Manhattan announced that combinations of antiretroviral treatment will be shown to work for people with advanced stages of HIV disease. At that point, I'd been a judge in South Africa for 2 years. I know I'd had my diagnosis for 10 years. I worked out that I'd been infected for about 11 years, but I hoped that I would never fall ill with AIDS. I carried on working, I'd thrown myself into my new work. I never thought that I'd become a judge. I had a democratic disposition in South Africa. I was inspired by my role, inspired by my work. I closed my mind to the possibility of my falling victim to death and to disease from AIDS. But eventually, the disease took over, as it does with 99% more people who are not treated. By September 1997, I was very severely ill. By November, I had many of the symptomatic presentations of AIDS. I had PCP in both my lungs, I had gastrointestinal thrush. It was the worst thing when you can't swallow. If you manage to swallow anything, your stomach can't digest it. Your mouth is covered with this furry. Have you seen thrush in your patients? To me, it was almost more horrifying than herpes. Treatment was very rarely available in South Africa. It was starting to become widely available in the United States. But I managed to stop taking it. It was extremely expensive. It took a third of my salary as a judge. It wasn't available publicly. It wasn't available through medical insurance. But I was able to take a third of my salary as a judge and stop paying for treatment in November 1997, nearly 14 years ago. And within 10 days, I knew that something completely astonishing had happened in my body. I could feel it. I could feel that there was a cessation of viral activity, because that's what the treatment does. It stops the virus in its tracks, stops replication. The virus retreats to very microscopic viral reservoirs in lymph nodes and brain membrane, perhaps in the testes, where it remains inert. If you stop treatment, it becomes active again. I've been taking drugs every single day for nearly 14 years. It's restored my health. I lead a very vigorous, active life. I'm a very active cyclist. We've got a beautiful cycling race in Cape Town called the Cape August. It's 110 kilometers around the Cape. I did my 6th Cape August this year. And I managed for the first time to bring my time down to below 4 hours, which I mentioned because the first time I did it, I thought something was going to happen. I thought somewhere between Muizenberg and Simonstown, halfway around the race, something was going to happen and I was going to fall off my bicycle because my body wouldn't work. But I mentioned that because antiretroviral therapy is so extraordinary. Most studies and tests now show that my life expectancy as a 58-year-old man on successfully maintained antiretroviral therapy is more or less the same. The medical evidence isn't unequivocal. Some of you who are specializing in this, read the latest articles, it's not unequivocal, but the preponderance of the evidence suggests that my life expectancy is the same as someone without HIV, which is completely astonishing. That was the physiological effect of starting treatment, but there was a deeper psychological effect. That was that I realized I could no longer stay silent. I've been involved in AIDS campaigning for many years, but I still was keeping my secret. A young woman called Edwin Cameron at the end of 1998, a woman from a Durban township called Mbazi, went on to a vernacular radio program called Radio Zoo and spoke about herself living with HIV. 3 weeks later, she was killed by members of her own community. She was stabbed and stoned to death. Edwin Cameron was the last precipitant that made me realize I lived in a suburban area, Johannesburg, kind of palisade. I had my judicial salary, which was paying for these extraordinarily expensive drugs. I could no longer keep quiet. I made a public statement in 1999 about the fact not just that I was living with HIV, but that my life had been given back to me by these drugs, and that it was iniquitous to keep these drugs for people throughout Africa who were entitled to them. And that had started The year before, the treatment action campaign had been founded to struggle against the drug companies which were enforcing intellectual property rights and patents to keep the prices of drugs very high. That in itself is a subject which deserves its own seminar discussion. That discussion, that fight was successful. The drug prices were drastically reduced. The combination I'm taking right now, which is Truvada and Virapine, is almost negligible in its cost. I've been taking it for many years. My viral load has been undetectable for almost 11 years now, which means that there's no medical or scientific instrument that can actually detect the virus. Find the antibodies, which you can't find. You can't find the virus itself. And the drugs that are sustaining me in this state of health are not expensive. I'm making 2 points. The one is that drug cost is no longer the major issue in antiretroviral treatment available in Africa and in your country. And the other point is that we need leadership. We need leadership, we need other considerations to deal with this epidemic, because physiologically, in terms of cost, we have the means to deal with this epidemic. Prices have come down, but a nightmare ensued in South Africa. The very time that the treatment action campaign was founded, a new president took office to succeed President Mandela. His name was President Thabo Mbeki, a very proud man who had a rightful sense of anger about the 300 years of denigration, subordination, and dispossession that white colonialists had inflicted on South Africa. He wanted his mission was the African Renaissance, which was to restore the pride and dignity of black people in Africa. He made this part of the explicit part of his mission. Within 6 months of taking office, that mission had led him into the most agonizing, disastrous, and tragic misstep, which was that he started questioning the link between HIV and AIDS. And the explicit reason for President Mbeki's skepticism was, I fear, racial and sexual. I've spoken about the stigma with President Ronald Reagan. I've spoken about the stigma with President Nelson Mandela. With President Thabo Mbeki, he took offense at the idea that there could be an epidemic, a mass epidemic of heterosexually transmitted HIV in one region only, a region of black Africans. And he said, you are white scientists, you are white epidemiologists, you are pronouncing a racist judgment on Africa. You are saying that we have sex like gay men. He actually made that explicit. He called it an insult to say that HIV had originated in Africa, where all the etiological signs pointed to the original cross-infection, interspecies infection having occurred in Africa. Why would it be an insult to say that the origin of a disease is in common in South America or Africa, unless you believe that that disease itself is shameful? Why is it an insult to determine the demography of the disease in a certain racial group, unless you believe that having that disease or the means of its transmission is itself shameful? Those were the premises that underlay President Mbeki's tragic misconception of AIDS. I could not remain silent. I was a judge in the High Court, later a judge in the now Supreme Court of Appeal. I found it impossible to remain silent, and I joined the treatment action campaign on public platforms and speaking out about the follies, the horror, and the stupidity of President Mbeki's folly. I was extremely outspoken. I did so knowing that judges normally, like in your country, some of your judges are very controversial, follow that with some sense of reserve. I think that I was called to speak out about HIV because I could not remain silent. We've had my life given back to me by the very drugs that President Mbeki was refusing to make available. His sources of this dreadfully misguided AIDS deniers were in fact bunch of really white scientists from your country, scientists and social scientists on the west coast of America, who doubted the link between HIV and AIDS, who said it's environmental. President Mbeki said this is due to poverty in the African continent. Because poverty has extended so far, there's no health care, it leads to a degeneration of the immune system. It is nonsense. The degeneration of the immune system of black Africans in Central and Southern Africa was caused by an identical pathogen of HIV, pathogen that was medically manageable with antiretroviral treatment. I said that as often as I could from my countries. I had my own health, my own life, the availability of the drugs through the actions of the treatment action campaign allows me to attribute that to. Well, President Mbeki didn't operate as in many other African countries through his own power alone. He was president of a constitutional state. And the treatment action campaign, having successfully taken on the drug companies, turned their attention to President Mbeki's aides and allies, and they took him to court. There was a monstrous battle fought in court by the government. The treatment action campaign and its allies fighting, and the courts eventually ruled in their favour. There's a right to health care under South Africa's constitution. The Constitutional Court, of which I'm now a member, appointed years after the decision, ruled that President Mbeki had to stop making the antiretroviral drugs available. And that court decision was the pivot in South Africa's response to HIV. It was the pivotal moment when the Constitutional Court ruled that President Mbeki's healthcare policies on HIV were unreasonable. That's the criterion in our Constitution. The government has to take reasonable steps to make healthcare available within its available resources to the people of South Africa. Well, the Constitutional Court said that his policy on HIV was not reasonable. It was a momentous decision, one which upheld the rule of law and the possibility of rationality and of reasoned normativity applied to public policy. Very exciting and I think ennobling decision from the court. And to President Mbeki's credit, I think it was another pivotal moment in South Africa's transition from the lawlessness of apartheid to the lawfulness of the constitutional state. President Mbeki, after some ambiguity expressed by his health minister on national television, which he said, we're not sure if we're going to obey the Constitutional Court. After that awful ambivalence, the Mbeki government decided to obey the courts. And I think that was an absolutely central moment in fixing the rule of law in South Africa. By the end of the year, there was a commitment to a national healthcare plan that would include antiretroviral treatment. By now, 7 or 8 years later, nearly 1.5 million people in South Africa are receiving antiretroviral drugs. Very similar to mine. The most frequently prescribed first-line treatment is Truvada and Stigma. I don't know if that's the same. Many physicians here treat people first line. No physicians here. Many like coats. We'll ask you later. But it's the world's largest successful antiretroviral rollout program. I want to make concluding remarks before your questions and your comments by saying we would not have 1.5 million people on successful antiretroviral treatment now without civil society activism, without the Congress of South African Trade Unions, the very organization to whom I was in the advisory capacity in the 1980s as an AIDS advisor, making an alliance with the treatment action campaign, the South African Council of Churches, without intense demonstrations on the streets of our townships and in our cities, without that society activism, without the instrumentation of the law. The law on its own is not enough. Civil society action on its own is not enough. You need a combination of the two. You need a rule of law in a state that subordinates government to law, but you also need an active citizenry that insists that government must be subordinate to the law. We have that in this campaign. It was an enrichment for our democracy, and I think a turning point in it. We've now got this very, very successful antiretroviral program. We've got a president whose sexual mores are a matter of public discussion, but at least he has taken the HIV test. I'm not taking a cheap shot at it. He's taken the HIV test. He announced its result, I think wrongly. I think he should have said, I'm keeping the test to myself. But he announced that the test was negative, and I think he sent the wrong message there. We can debate that. But he's got a health nurse, Dr. Edwin Cameron. Some of you who work in South Africa will know that he's a wonderful man, a man who knows what has to be done in this area. He feels a sense of urgency about it. He's a practical man who's making very successful interventions. The one area where our interventions are lacking is in prevention. I know that many of you are worried about prevention as well. We have about 300,000 new infections every year. So for every 2 people we put on treatment every year, 3 people die. And it's an impossible situation. I'm very ambivalent about prevention. We can speak about it. People say to me, well, why don't young people in South Africa just use a condom? Then I ask, how many people smoke in the United States? 1/5 is about 18% of your population. That's after 60 years. It was 1951 when Professor Richard Dole in Oxford discovered the link between smoking and cancer. By the end of the 1950s, governments of Western Europe and North America had accepted that link and made them feature of public policy to discourage smoking. 50 years later, we still have 18% of the population of your country smoking. And I'm sure that people here are one of the most embarrassing Muslims. You've seen students smoking all over the country. So when you pass judgment, this is what I've got to do, because so much of our discourse, so much of our thinking about HIV is about passing judgment. If you pass judgment, those 300,000 young South Africans who become infected with HIV every year, think about the smokers who full knowledge of the harm that smoking represents, nevertheless light up. And then think how much more strongly the impulse to sexual connection is. I speak about that humbly because when I was infected, at least in 1985, I wasn't infected with AIDS. I knew that there was a risk. I didn't think I would touch it. I took that chance. As far as smokers do, I think I hope that I won't be one of those cancer statistics. And I understand from a position of very deep humility the difficulties of being able to change policy and behavior. But the important point is the way that we pass judgment. It is to find this epidemic, it is to find management of the political response to it, the social response to it. I think we have to understand stigma before we can properly treat it, before we can properly prevent the transmission of HIV. I think it's the key to understanding the history of the epidemic for the last 30 years. It's the key to understanding its future. Thank you very much.
One, the fact that antiretroviral medications here in the U.S. are very expensive. So we do not have generics available here. Generics will start becoming available soon, but only very few of them. And so an average regimen here costs cheapest, I would say, is like $14,000. Most of them are around $20,000 per year. For a percentage of our patients who are HIV infected do not have insurance. And then it's a question of how they do get those medications. They have an AIDS drug assistance program. North Carolina is one of the states that has the poorest financial input into their AIDS drug assistance program, and is perpetually in this state that they have to have people on waiting lists. And then when the budget is in, they're able to open up the waiting list, put some additional people on, and then it shuts down right away, and we have the waiting list again. So one of the things that's really important that you spoke about was going on treatment and how treatment then made you be able to feel like I've got to speak about this because now I've seen what medications can do. Well, here we have the problem that it's very difficult to convince people to test for HIV when they may not have access to medication. And so we have to look at access.
I would say, if I could just interrupt, and I want you to come back to your comments. I think that the availability of treatment changes the whole question of testing. It enables the imposition of a medical beneficence model where you can say you should be tested. I fully support that. But I think in the absence of treatment, what is the incentive to test? So I think it is absolutely vital to make it available.
And to add on to that, now there's the whole prevention as well. There was a study, the results were a study for an HIV prevention trials network study for release, and it showed that when people are on ARVs and have their virus controlled, that they do not transmit virus to someone else. It really greatly reduces. So when we're talking about prevention, right there, to have people on treatment and to kind of convince our government that it makes sense to put people on treatment. We're constantly kind of going back and forth about what's the proper number to start after starting people, when will they get into trouble, when won't they. And we know that there is something going on in their life that is bad. It doesn't.
I agree with that. I think even before we've reached 350 CD4. Thank you very much. Can I take some other questions? Yes, I'll take you and then I'll take you. Yes.
How did you feel like when you made your announcement? Did your friends, family start treating you different now that they knew you were HIV?
Thank you very much for asking that. The question is, how did I feel about making my announcement? I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. And I understand from that point of view, when I made my public statement in 1999, I did so knowing the specificities of my own condition. I was a gay man, I was a white man, in an epidemic that was overwhelmingly heterosexual in Africa. And I expected that there would be black heterosexual leaders who would follow. It's been 12 years since and it hasn't happened. And I find that those people are still feeling the terror that I felt. I had prepared my inner circle, my closest friends and my family for this, a small circle of colleagues whom I told. But I was absolutely overwhelmed by the response. It was an extraordinary response. I'd been interviewed in Cape Town for a position on the port which I now occupy. I wasn't appointed at that time. And I'd flown back, and the next morning when I went into my office at the port, flowers and cards everywhere, colleagues came to see me. The response was overwhelmingly loving and affirming. That made me understand the second thing. One is the fear. The second is that much of this stigma is internalized. Until we start understanding the mechanisms of internal stigma, we're not going to be able to overcome it. That is not to blame the person with HIV because of their own inaction. It's to understand the motive forces of it. So people in our government, we have cabinet ministers, soccer stars, singers, very, very famous people who die. They die of lung disease or tuberculosis, or often they say they die of diabetes. They're prominent people. And most people know, and it's rumored in their database, but no one wishes to say that. And we understand that fear of being associated with the disease. We've not yet got to the point where any other public official in Africa has been willing. No black public official in Africa has yet said. And that's because of that fear. But the response, I find, has been overwhelmingly well. I was very grateful for that. It changed my life. Yes, sir.
I'm a medical student from Kenya. I'm sorry, that's why I had a white coat and I had no idea what you guys have here.
We can give you a quick examination of it.
Yes. Yes, I'm just a week old. Yeah. Thank you for your talk. It's very inspiring. So my question is, what is the current situation in South Africa in terms of treatment? Because if I give it a comparison with Kenya, the stigma, of course, it's a big issue. But in terms of treatment, at least they're doing something in terms of people are being given generic drugs for free. So the combination there is sort of, I don't know if it's the same, it's Combivia and Triamine. So we give them free.
We're using Truvada rather than Combivia. It's a slight variation of the two drugs.
So we give them free treatment.
Truvada's got to offer the
So give them free food, free treatment, and things like that. So it sort of has helped them come out and it's kind of working with stigma. So what's the situation in South Africa?
It's made available publicly and freely, and there was a mass testing drive 18 months ago, in which about 12 million people in South Africa, nearly a quarter of the population, were tested. So it's a very, led by our health minister, Dr. Williams, and it was a very successful testing drive. So many more people discovered their status, and there was a massive upsurge. About 300,000 people last year alone joined lists of those getting publicly funded antiretroviral treatments. We still have a death rate annually of about 200,000 from AIDS. A lot of it is associated with tuberculosis now. Most AIDS deaths are in fact AIDS plus tuberculosis deaths. So there's a long way still to go in understanding stigma, in ramping up prevention. I think all three have to be interconnected and providing treatment. Thank you for your report. Questions? Yes, sir. And then I'll come to you, sir. Yes.
So in the Southeast, a lot of the stigma is driven by the church and the reaction of the church particularly. I'm wondering in South Africa whether that's a factor in the reaction of people.
We were lucky in South Africa. One of the reasons I think that we've had a successful transition to democracy was, first of all, I don't wish to be racially condescending or racially essentialist, but the essentially forgiving nature of the black majority in South Africa. There was a big spiritedness, which is embodied in Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who some of you will have heard speak, who sees the slights and understands the history of oppression and its injustice and wants to right it, and doesn't take it personally in a way of wanting to wreak vengeance. We were very lucky. Another thing that we were lucky about is that there's no predominant religious dogmatism in South Africa. None of the monotheistic religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, have a hold on South Africa. And I think that's what passes on. And I think it does play a part in stigma. Churches have tried to get together to reduce stigma, but the fact that there's no predominant religious ideology meant that there hasn't been a religious further connection to stigma in South Africa. Yes. Take the lady in front of you afterwards. Yes.
Justice Cameron, thank you so much for your remarks. They were very inspiring. Could you please share with us what you would like to see from the young activists in this room? What would you like us to do in the coming months?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. I'd like you to find out what the prevalence is, the estimated prevalence in your country. Many of you are in the medical school and public health. I want you to normalize the disease. The medicalization of the disease has been a huge step forward, but it's not enough. We've got to normalize it in our social relations. Each of you has got to come to the point in your own families, in your own societies. And we've got to understand the demography of the disease as well. President Mbeki was wrong to say that there's something shameful about the fact that the disease was preponderantly amongst black heterosexuals. He was wrong for many reasons, partly because I think he was also wrong. I don't think that sexual behavior alone explains the racial epidemiology of the disease in Africa. I believe personally, and I believe that this will come out eventually, that there is a genetic cofactor amongst the Bantu-speaking peoples of Central and Southern Africa, from Kenya down to South Africa. There's been no mass HIV epidemic in West Africa. So it's not about black people's sexual behavior, it's about understanding the agents of transmission within the African American community, within the sub-communities in your country, without any sense of racialized shame about it. I'd ask people, particularly people with access to the African American community, to go out with that, to say this is a disease, it's medically manageable. The message of medical manageability, the message of prevention, and the message of normalization. That's what I'd ask.
I just wanted to say thank you for coming to speak to us, and I have a question about the relationship between sex work and the transmission of HIV. Over the summer, I worked at the Women's Legal Center in Cape Town. One of their partner organizations was sex work advocacy or
SWET.
education. Yes, SWET.
That's
SWET.
right.
So I was just
Sex work education and advocacy task force.
okay. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between sex work and transmission of HIV, and if sex work was to be decriminalized in South Africa, what effect would that have on the transmission?
Well, we've got to go back a few steps. the first question you've got to ask is it right to use criminal law to police people's sexual behavior? That's the big debate. And Sweat itself is an advocacy party for the decriminalization of sex work. I keep an open mind on a lot of things. I keep an open mind on this issue because when it comes to our court. In our court ruled 6-5 about 8 years ago that it was okay for the state to criminalize sex work, just like your High Court ruled in Bowers versus Hartley in 1985 5-4, that it was okay for the state to criminalize same-sex conduct privately. So that issue may return. It returned to your High Court in Lawrence, Texas. It may return to our court. I don't want to express any views, but Sweat advocates decriminalization. The first question is, what is the business of the law? Should the law be policing the way that women use their bodies? Even women use their bodies in ways that are seen as being exploitative and degrading to them. What is reported by most sex workers in Johannesburg and in Cape Town is that they are harassed by the police because of criminal prohibitions, that they are stigmatized, that if they are found standing on a street corner with condoms in their persons, that the police take that as evidence that they are criminals. Therefore, it's a disincentive to keep condoms with them. I think that the stigma of sex work and the stigma of what is called prostitution mirrors the stigma of HIV. It's about sexual conduct. We still find great difficulty in relating to sexual conduct. As I said earlier, it's to do with the fact that it's such an intimate and complex part of our own mission as humans. We don't understand it. We condemn people who've got HIV. We condemn women who trade their bodies for sex. And I think that is the difficulty. In Africa, sex workers played a very minor role in the transmission of HIV, and yet, because they branded and stigmatized, they blamed for it. 99% of the HIV transmissions in South Africa occurred between sexually consenting, non-transactional adults, not with sex workers. Sex workers played an almost negligible role here. Your question to me, would the decriminalization of sex work affect the HIV transmission? I'm not going to express my own opinion. I'm going to keep my own mind. I'm going to express the opinion of the World Health Organization and the UNAIDS. They say abolish criminal prohibitions. It's the sensible thing to do. And while Ireland's talking about that, they also say change the war on drugs. That's a different issue. I'll just have an open mind on that. Yes, so I'll take your question and yours, and then I saw... Yes, I'll take your two questions. Yes.
All right, so I lived in Johannesburg. You guys lived in Zimbabwe, but I lived in Johannesburg for like 3 years. And I've seen the vast migration of Zimbabweans, Swaziland, people, Lesotho, and all those people coming to Johannesburg, looking for in South Africa. And I've seen the good work that TS is doing.
You're talking about the fact that there's been a very huge influx of other Africans into South Africa since 1990, in the last 20 years.
So, my question is, TS is exclusive in South Africa, and aid that comes to South Africa probably breeding somewhere outside South Africa, in Zimbabwe, Botswana, somewhere. What are they doing actually to bring those countries together and do something, probably big project, so that, you know, this movement of people and the spread of disease can be curtailed?
Well, the movement of people, the movement of people is caused by geopolitical factors. Your President Robert Mugabe has a big part in the fact that there are 2 or 3 million Zimbabweans in South Africa. Economically productive, I might say. You know, most Zimbabweans that you know in Johannesburg are probably working very hard, earning a living, driving economic productivity. So the geopolitical factors work. But I think you're making a different point, which is that outside South Africa, there are not very advanced civil society sectors in countries like Kenya. There are civil society sectors in Kenya. Kenya is just your constitutional transition. Kenya got a new constitution on the 4th of August last year. This gentleman's compatriots voted to adopt the new constitution. The constitution's Bill of Rights is modeled on South Africa's Bill of Rights. And it was driven by your civil society sector, NGOs, youth groups, township groups, which is a wonderful manifestation. Zimbabwe has always been relatively weak. Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions gays and lesbians of Zimbabwe, various civil society groups existed that weren't as strong. I think the lesson for Africa is that we need more civil society action and sometimes less government. I think that lies behind the question. Thank you.
There's a part of civil society in South Africa that absolutely amazed me its action in the early 90s, which was the trade unions. They went side by side with capitalists in court cases.
Trade unions in South Africa supported the Treatment Action Campaign, even though they're the alliance partner in government of the African National Congress.
Given my experience here, which is very different, how do you explain that? I mean, why did they? There was a lot to lose.
The gentleman's asking the question about why the trade union sided with the Treatment Action Campaign. It goes back to my answer to our Zimbabwean colleague, which is that one of the beneficial effects of apartheid is that over 100 years, the ANC was founded in 1912, is that it conscientized and activated the majority of South Africans. You have South Africans who are intensely aware of their constitutional rights, intensely critical of government. And the trade union movement, under the apartheid government, they founded an industrial port. In 1980, they abolished the ban on black trade unions. Until 1979, you couldn't have black trade unions. After 1980, in the last 10 years of apartheid, the black trade union movement flourished. So you had, by the time the ANC returned from exile, you had an internal force which had mobilized more than 500,000 South African workers, which was articulate, which was versed in the processes of internal debate and democracy and policy formulation. So by the time we had President Mbeki who took this bizarre stand on HIV, the trade union movement was strong enough to be critical of it. And I think that's the answer to your question. Some more questions? I've seen you and then, yes, okay. Shall we take this gentleman, that lady, and then who else? I've got 2 questions. You and then you. Shall we take those last 4 questions? Is that all right? Anyone burning? Who's been burning? Yes, sorry. Okay, you'll be the 5th and the last. Okay. Yes. Sorry, who did I see on this? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I understand you've made trips to China recently, and I wonder if you could just speak about your impression of HIV stigma in China and how that compares to South Africa, particularly earlier in the
It's very interesting in China because the President of China and the Prime Minister have been very active in opposing HIV stigma. It's very interesting. My book was translated into Chinese by a Chinese government agency working with UNAIDS. It's very interesting. So they oppose stigma, and the Premier and the President both visited AIDS homes. There's not going to be a generalized epidemic in either China or India. They were very scared in both countries. In India, they were waiting from the early 1990s, from the time that Thailand started taking action for this generalized epidemic to occur. It hasn't occurred. I believe it hasn't occurred for the same reason that I think the only mass heterosexual epidemic in the world is in Central and Southern Africa, because I believe strongly that there's a genetic cofactor in our region. And I don't think that the geneticists suggest that adequately yet. But stigma in China is high. But the people with HIV, even though there's public leadership against stigma, are still highly stigmatized. What else did I say? Yes.
I was just wondering if you've ever felt any judgment from a healthcare provider in your experience, and also if you have any advice for healthcare providers in helping patients deal with that internalized stigma that you talked about.
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. It's hard to know. I had an unfortunate experience when I was tested by a well-meaning family doctor who tested me without my consent. I now take the view that testing should be an automatic part of your presentation, that there should be implied consent taken, the opt-out approach. If you don't want to be tested, you've got to say you don't want to be tested. And we're moving to that position. So I don't complain often about that, but it was a shocking experience. It's hard to know if people are judging you if you're very upfront about something. I've been very frontal about my homosexuality since I was in my mid-30s. I've been very frontal about my HIV status since 1999. And if there is a stigma or judgment. It's hard. I think people wouldn't express it to you. It's like racists don't express their racism directly to the face of the people that they feel towards. So I haven't felt that. But how to address it? I think that's a very subtle and important question. How do you address the fact that you as a healthcare worker are in some way passing a judgment? You'll deal with a smoker whose lung disease was almost certainly caused, or emphysema was almost certainly caused, or heavily cofactored by smoking. You'll deal with an obese person without judgment. But you bring a different judgment to someone who is infected by sexual transmission. And I think that there's something difficult about that. It's very difficult because it lies so far deep within us, but it's also hopeful. Because like other forms of prejudice, it lies here, and you can start working here, right inside your own head and spirit. That's what I'd like everyone to start doing. Thank you. Your question, and then, am I right? These are the last two? Is there someone? Yes, I missed you. We'll take this lady, and then this gentleman, and then this lady.
Kind of tying in with Ashley's question, in your experience as an advocate from a perspective of intervention, what has been the most successful in the communities in erasing that stigma or helping with it? What is it? Public people coming forward? Is it education? Is it like, what is it at the grassroots level that's working best?
I would say it's the availability of treatment has turned around in Botswana. At the very time President Mbeki was doubting the etiology of AIDS, President Festus Mogae in Botswana on the 1st of May 2001 said, I'm going to provide all Botswana who need treatments. I think the availability of treatment has been pivotal in the social media of disease. The interesting thing is, I made a point, and I made a limited point in answer to this lady here, which is that there aren't public figures, people holding public office in Africa, who speak out about living with HIV, but there are many working class people. The Treatment Action Campaign produced that T-shirt which said HIV positive. It became one of the most famous T-shirts ever produced, and rightly so, because you didn't know who had HIV and who didn't have HIV. So there are working class people, the people in the townships who are living openly with HIV, and treatment has accelerated the number of people who speak very readily. We've got a system of prison visits in the court I'm in. And last month I went and visited 2 prisons in a remote rural area in our country. And when I spoke to each group of prisoners, I spoke about myself, spoke about the necessity for condom use in prison, and many people put up their hands and said, I'm HIV. So we've reached a tipping point in our country. And I think it's many things. It's knowing someone who's died of HIV. It's that point that I reached in my own sexuality of saying, never again, to hell with this. We cannot remain silent about this. We've got to accept it and do something about it. And I think that point is often reached with someone. I think social activism in the working classes and townships of South Africa, and I do think the availability of treatment. Thank you. Yes, sir.
In the United States, there's been a recent increase in incidence of HIV infection in gay communities. What advice would you give to young gay men on how to protect themselves, how to protect their communities, and how to bring attention to the crisis?
Talking. I see that myself in the gay community in Johannesburg. I think that we have prevalences which are equivalent to those in San Francisco, New York City in the early 80s, 30 years ago. I think we've got 30 to 40% prevalences. One of the paradoxes of our struggle against HIV in Africa, because it was a mass heterosexual epidemic, is that there was insufficient attention paid to the special needs of communities having sex with men. And many of the leaders in the HIV awareness campaign, like myself, were gay men. Zaki Ahmed is a gay man. I'm a gay man. And we were willing in a way to collude with the heterosexual focus without insisting, and wrongly so, I criticize myself exactly for it, on special attention, because the most at-risk people are those engaging in receptive anal intercourse, and we haven't got that message out. How to get that message out? People talk about it in the gay bars. Are there gay bars in Durham? No gay bars in Durham. Well, there are. This lady knows. Sorry, I didn't say. In fact, don't, you shouldn't laugh, because I thought that you were signifying something. I would say talk. I would say talk about it. If just talk about it, because it's like insulin-dependent diabetes. There are trigger factors. It's very easy to avoid getting HIV. And the more you talk about it, the more you normalize the risk, the more you talk about it. There's no young gay man emerging into sexual consciousness, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, you should not be talking about it. So I think the most important thing is awareness and talking about it. Asking people to protect themselves, because that phenomenon is terrifying. There is treatment. I'm an example of successfully sustained antiretroviral treatment, but it's 3 tablets a day for the rest of my life. I don't want to be taking that. I spoke about my longevity prospect earlier. There's some studies that show that there are heightened risks of heart disease, of certain forms of cancer, even on sustained successful antiretroviral therapy. Talk about those. For a young man coming out now, very beautiful and magnificent, assertion of his own sexuality, but at particular risk of HIV infection. The more we talk about it, the better. So thanks for raising that. Last question.
You spoke earlier about the need for leaders and looking forward, do you think that this leadership will just be confined to the treatment action campaign working class, or do you think eventually prominent figures will become
It's very hard. I mean, apart from Magic Johnson, have there been other prominent Americans in the past? Are there prominent church leaders or politicians? Is there a publicly elected official living with HIV? I think Magic Johnson is probably the only one. I've given up hoping. Sorry, yes? Yes, that's right. Greg Loudan, the Olympic medalist in swimming. That's quite right. Sorry. I've given up hoping that it will happen. And I don't condemn people because I know my own fears. I know the own extent to which internalized stigma played a part in it. So I think the struggle is more about what this gentleman asked about, which is civil society. It's more about mobilizing communities. It's more about talking on person-to-person level than hoping for political leadership. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies.